This is Faculty Focus from Fairleigh Dickinson University. On this episode, we feature Dr. Krista Jenkins, Associate Professor of Political Science. Dr. Jenkins' primary areas of expertise include gender and politics, public opinion, and youth and democracy. In this segment, we focus on young people and politics.
Because we have a democratic system of government that requires a great deal of citizens to actually engage in an enlightened fashion. And if you have particularly young people who are increasingly being not taught, the basics of our democratic process, they reach a certain age, they're expected to vote, they're expected to take part in the democratic process. And if they don't have, basic civic skills behind them, then what happens is they end up, I think, taking part, voting, getting excited about a particular candidate, thinking that perhaps change is going to come about rather quickly, and feeling, not very happy, 2 or 4 years later when that change didn't really happen. And of course, I think what I'm referencing here is the 2008 election with Obama. There was this great expectation that young people would maintain their passion and their energy for the process. And it is a little too early to tell if that's actually going to happen, but the fact that they don't have those basic skills under their belt, I think for those of us who know a little bit about youth and politics, we're a little worried that their first entrance into the political process will not be something that is ultimately rewarded because of their pretty high expectations for how quickly change can come about. Youth vote is generally people under the age of 30. It sort of, the definition sort of is dependent on, oftentimes birth year, things of that sort. But usually when you hear people reference the youth vote in the press, they're usually talking about people 18 to 29 years of age. There were many origins to, the passage of the 26th Amendment, but I think the major thing that really motivated young people to become interested in advocating for their rights was, of course, the Vietnam War and this belief that if they could be drafted and called to service and ultimately die for their country, they should also, at the age of 18, they should also be given the right to take part in the process and elect leaders who would ultimately determine their fate. So it was an issue. It was an issue or a series of issues really that motivated young people to unite. But you also have to think about the passage of the 26th in the context of the times in which it was passed. This was the 60s. This was the 70s. There was tremendous social movements taking place, and there was more citizen activism. One of the things that I often talk about with my students is, what would motivate you? What would really get you to turn out in large numbers? And I've been a professor pretty much since the beginning of the war, in Iraq, 2003. And they will often say, the thing that would really get us motivated is if they reinstituted the draft. There's plenty of issues currently that affect young people. I don't necessarily think that it is an issue-based explanation for why they are not taking part. I would go back to what I said previously. Many of them simply lack a fundamental understanding of how it all works. Oftentimes, I think what the news does is assume a certain level of knowledge. And so if you're somebody who really wants to understand what's going on and, cast an informed vote, oftentimes if you read the newspaper or watch, news on television, assuming what you're even getting is real news and not opinion journalism, there's a certain level of basic knowledge that is expected that young people simply lack. Well, I mean, you could certainly put some burden of responsibility on candidates themselves. I mean, oftentimes candidates recognize that they can pretty much write off young people because they're not going to vote, and so they pitch their message to older voters. If candidates, took more interest in trying to genuinely reach out to young people, explain their positions to them, and try to connect with them in a very real way. We saw that's what happened in 2008. I mean, President Obama was terrific at mobilizing the youth vote because he spoke directly to them and connected with them through social media sources and things like that. So part of it can simply be, candidates themselves, but it can also be parents, it can also be institutions recognizing that there is a real value to teaching these things. And not shying away from it, because I think the other thing that's happened over the years is we hear politics and we hear, oh, that's something that should only be talked about in the home. And as a professor, I'm often, worried that if I bring my own politics into the classroom, I will be labeled as a proselytizer and somebody who's trying to instill my own political values on students. In fact, I actually find that when I do bring my own politics into the classroom, they get interested. You know, it becomes more of an interesting dialogue as opposed to one where I am dogmatically lecturing about things like federalism and, you know, the makeup of Congress and, you know, what the framers intended for our system. So it's a there is no single bullet, essentially, to what's going to fix this. It is a multi-layered problem with many solutions that need to come into play.